This story will move you to tears. If you love emotional journeys that stay with you long after they end, subscribe now so you never miss a story. Your support means everything to us. Asterisk, the afternoon sun blazed over the military base as hundreds of soldiers stood in perfect formation along the runway. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots polished to a mirror shine. Every eye was fixed on the transport plane that had just landed, its engines still humming as it rolled to a stop. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire base seemed to hold its breath. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been gone for 8 months. 8 long months of leading her unit through one of the most dangerous missions in recent military history. The mission had been classified, tucked away in folders that most people would never see. But everyone on the base knew something had gone terribly wrong. They knew because only half of her unit had returned 2 weeks ago. The other half, including Sarah, had stayed behind. The reasons were unclear. Wrapped in the kind of silence that makes people whisper and wonder, the plane's door opened slowly. A set of metal stairs was rolled into position by 2 young airmen who moved with careful precision. The crowd of soldiers waited, their faces showing nothing but respect and discipline. Some of them had served with Sarah. Others had only heard the stories about the fearless captain who always put her team first. Today, they were all here for her. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs. She wore her uniform, but something about her seemed different. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high, but there was a weight in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She paused for just a moment, taking in the sight of her fellow soldiers standing at attention. Her hand moved to her chest, pressing against something beneath her uniform. Then she began to descend the stairs. One careful step at a time, as her boots touched the tarmac, something remarkable happened. The base commander, a stern man with 30 years of service, raised his hand in salute. Immediately, every soldier on that runway did the same. Hundreds of hands moved as one, rising to honor the woman who had just returned home. The sound of hands hitting uniforms echoed across the airfield like a drumbeat. Sarah stopped walking. Her eyes moved across the sea of saluting soldiers. And for the first time since she had boarded that plane 8 months ago, tears began to fill her eyes. She had prepared herself for many things, but not for this. Not for this overwhelming show of respect and solidarity. She lifted her own hand, returning the salute with as much strength as she could gather. Her hand trembled slightly, but it stayed firm. Then something unexpected happened. The base commander lowered his salute and simply stood there, watching her. One by one, the other soldiers did the same. But instead of breaking formation or returning to their duties, they remained perfectly still. A powerful silence fell over the entire base. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. It said, "We see you, we honor you, and we understand that something has changed." Sarah had never imagined her homecoming would look like this. During those long nights in the desert, when sandstorms raged outside their temporary shelter and enemy fire cracked in the distance, she had dreamed of returning to normalcy. She had pictured herself walking through the base gates, maybe sharing a quiet meal with her few close friends, trying to forget the things she had seen. She had never expected hundreds of people to be waiting for her. She had never expected this moment to feel so heavy and so meaningful at the same time. The silence continued to stretch across the runway. Sarah stood there, her duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, trying to process what was happening. She looked at the faces around her, really looked at them. Some were young soldiers she had helped train before her deployment. Others were officers she had served alongside for years. In their eyes, she saw something that both comforted and broke her. They knew. Somehow they knew that she had experienced something that would mark her forever. Colonel James Peterson, the base commander, finally stepped forward. He was a tall man with silver hair and a face that rarely showed emotion. But today, there was something soft in his expression. He stopped a few feet from Sarah and simply nodded to her. No words, no formal speech, just a nod that said everything. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had been holding herself together through sheer will. But this simple gesture of understanding nearly broke her. Behind the colonel, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. A group of soldiers stood slightly apart from the others. They wore the same unit insignia she did. These were the men and women who had come home 2 weeks before her. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, Sergeant Jennifer Williams, Corporal David Torres. They had survived the same hell she had. They had lost the same friends. When her eyes met theirs, no words were needed. They had made a pact during those final days in enemy territory. They had promised each other that if they made it home, they would honor those who didn't. This moment was part of that promise. The colonel gestured toward a vehicle waiting at the edge of the runway. Sarah understood. The formal welcome was over. It was time to move forward, to begin the long process of coming home. She adjusted her duffel bag and started walking. With each step, the rows of soldiers remained frozen in that powerful silence. It was as if the entire base had become a living memorial, a breathing tribute to sacrifice and service. As Sarah passed the rows of standing soldiers, some of them had tears streaming down their faces. These were hardened military personnel, people trained to keep their emotions in check, but today was different. Today they weren't just saluting a returning officer. They were acknowledging something bigger. They were recognizing the cost of service, the weight of command, and the price paid by those who lead others into danger. The vehicle drove slowly through the base, passing familiar buildings and training grounds. Sarah sat in the back seat, staring out the window, but seeing nothing. Her mind was still on the runway, still processing that moment of collective silence. Colonel Peterson sat beside her, giving her space, but remaining present. He had seen this before, the difficult transition from combat to home, from constant danger to sudden safety. He knew that silence was sometimes the best gift you could give someone. They arrived at the administrative building where Sarah would need to complete her return paperwork. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she noticed more soldiers standing quietly nearby. They weren't in formation this time. They were simply there, watching, showing their support in the only way they knew how. A young private, barely 20 years old, caught her eye. He stood at attention, his hand raised in a crisp salute. Sarah recognized him. She had taught him hand-to-hand combat techniques during a training session almost a year ago. He had been nervous and clumsy then. Now he stood like a soldier, honoring her return. Inside the building, the atmosphere was different. The silence from outside didn't exist here. There were phones ringing, people talking, the normal sounds of military administration. But when Sarah walked through the door, everything stopped. Clerks looked up from their computers. Officers paused mid-conversation. For a moment, that powerful silence returned, following her like a shadow. Then, quietly, people returned to their work. But there was a new awareness in the room. The captain who had faced the impossible was among them. Major Rebecca Foster appeared from one of the offices. She had been Sarah's mentor years ago, when Sarah was just a lieutenant learning how to lead. Rebecca's face was composed, professional, but her eyes told a different story. She approached Sarah and did something unexpected. Instead of saluting or offering formal words, she simply placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder and squeezed gently. It was a gesture between friends, between sisters in arms, between two people who understood that some experiences change you forever. The paperwork was mercifully brief. Colonel Peterson had apparently arranged for most of it to be handled in advance. Sarah signed a few documents, confirmed her contact information, and was given a schedule for her mandatory debriefings and medical evaluations. The whole process took less than 30 minutes. As she prepared to leave, Rebecca walked her to the door. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The base had returned to its normal rhythm. Soldiers were heading to the mess hall for dinner. Vehicles moved along the roads. Training exercises continued in the distance. But Sarah noticed something. As she walked across the compound, people kept stopping to look at her. Not with curiosity, but with respect. Some nodded. Others saluted quietly. A few simply stood still, acknowledging her presence with that same powerful silence that had greeted her on the runway. Sarah's quarters were exactly as she had left them. The bed was made with military precision. Her few personal belongings were arranged neatly on the desk and shelves. Someone had cleaned the room while she was gone, keeping the dust away. On her desk, she found a stack of letters. They were from soldiers on the base, notes of welcome and support. She picked up the first one. It's written in careful handwriting. The letter was from Private Emma Rodriguez, a young woman in her early 20s. She wrote about how Sarah had inspired her to join the military, how seeing a female captain had shown her what was possible. She thanked Sarah for her service and said that whatever had happened during the mission, the base stood behind her. Sarah set the letter down carefully and picked up the next one. Then the next. Each letter carried the same message in different words. You are not alone. We honor your sacrifice. Welcome home. There was a knock on the door. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and called out for the person to enter. It was Lieutenant Marcus Chen, one of the soldiers from her unit who had returned 2 weeks earlier. Marcus was a quiet man in his 30s, a skilled tactician who rarely showed emotion. But now his face was drawn, his eyes carrying the same weight as Sarah's. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, and Sarah understood. They had shared something that nobody else could fully comprehend. They had watched friends die. They had made impossible decisions. They had survived when others hadn't. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice rough with emotion. He told Sarah that the other survivors from their unit wanted to meet tomorrow. They needed to talk, to process, to begin healing together. Sarah nodded. She knew this was necessary, even though every part of her wanted to hide away and deal with her pain alone. After Marcus left, Sarah sat on her bed and finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back. The tears came hard and fast. She cried for the soldiers she had lost. She cried for the choices she had been forced to make. She cried for the person she used to be, the captain who had left 8 months ago full of confidence and determination. That person felt like a stranger now. In her place was someone harder, wiser, infinitely more aware of how fragile life could be. But mixed with the pain was something else. Gratitude. That moment on the runway, that powerful silence, had given her something she didn't know she needed. It had shown her that her service mattered, that her sacrifice was seen, and that she was part of something bigger than herself. The military community had wrapped itself around her like a protective blanket, offering support without demanding explanations. In that silence, they had said everything she needed to hear. The next morning arrived too quickly. Sarah had barely slept, her mind replaying memories she wished she could forget. She dressed in her uniform and made her way to the small conference room where Marcus had said they would meet. The walk across the base felt different in daylight. Soldiers went about their duties, but many stopped to acknowledge her. Some saluted. Others nodded. A few brave souls approached to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Sarah accepted each gesture with as much grace as she could manage, though every interaction left her feeling more exposed. The conference room was tucked away in a quiet corner of the base. When Sarah entered, she found the other survivors already there. Marcus, Jennifer, David, and 3 others. 7 soldiers out of the original 15 who had deployed. They sat around the table in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When Sarah took her seat, Jennifer reached over and squeezed her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. They talked for hours. Not about tactics or mission details. Those things would come later in official debriefings. Instead, they talked about their feelings. About the guilt of surviving when friends hadn't. About the nightmares that woke them in the middle of the night. About the strange disconnect of being back in a safe place when their minds were still stuck in the danger zone. Each person shared their struggles, and in doing so, they began to lighten the load they each carried. Sarah learned that the other survivors had also been greeted with profound respect when they returned. The base had understood somehow that this mission had been different, that these soldiers had experienced something that required special acknowledgement. The 2 weeks they had been back had been filled with therapy sessions, medical checkups, and quiet support from the military community. They assured Sarah that she would receive the same care, that the base took care of its own. As the meeting ended, David spoke up. He was the youngest of the survivors, barely 25, but the mission had aged him. He said that they had decided to create a memorial for the soldiers they had lost. Something private, just for their unit, where they could go to remember and honor their fallen friends. He asked if Sarah would help with the planning. She agreed immediately. It felt important to do something tangible, to create a space where their grief could live alongside their memories. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into a new routine. She attended debriefing sessions where she carefully recounted the mission details. She met with therapists who helped her process her trauma. She participated in physical training to rebuild her strength. And slowly, painfully, she began to accept that she was home, that the danger had passed, and that she had to find a way to live with what had happened. The memorial ceremony took place 6 weeks after Sarah's return. The unit had chosen a quiet spot near the edge of the base, under a large oak tree that had stood for decades. They had commissioned a simple stone marker with the names of the 8 soldiers who hadn't come home. Family members had been invited, and the base commander had arranged for full military honors. The day was overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Sarah stood with her surviving unit members, all of them in dress uniform. As family members arrived, Sarah greeted each one, offering condolences and sharing stories about their loved ones. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, looking into the eyes of mothers and fathers, wives and husbands, children who would grow up without a parent. But it was also necessary. These families needed to know that their loved ones had been brave, that they had been honored, that they would never be forgotten. The ceremony began with the base chaplain offering words of comfort. Then Colonel Peterson spoke about sacrifice and duty, about the price of freedom and the debt owed to those who serve. His words were formal but heartfelt. When he finished, he looked directly at Sarah and nodded. It was time for her to speak. Sarah approached the memorial stone on trembling legs. She had prepared remarks, words carefully chosen to honor her fallen soldiers. But when she opened her mouth, everything she had planned disappeared. Instead, she spoke from her heart. She talked about each soldier individually, sharing their quirks and strengths, their dreams and fears. She spoke about how they had trusted her leadership, how they had followed her into impossible situations with courage and determination. As she spoke, that powerful silence descended once again. Every person present, from the highest-ranking officer to the youngest child, stood completely still. The wind died down. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. It was as if the entire world had paused to honor these fallen heroes. Sarah felt that silence wrap around her words, giving them weight and meaning. When she finished speaking, she placed her hand on the memorial stone and whispered a private goodbye to each name carved there. The ceremony concluded with a 21-gun salute that echoed across the base. As the final shot rang out, Sarah noticed something. All around the memorial site, beyond the immediate gathering, stood hundreds of soldiers. They had come quietly, without announcement, to pay their respects. They lined the nearby paths, stood beneath trees, formed silent groups on the hillside. The entire base had turned out to honor the fallen and support the survivors. After the ceremony, as people slowly dispersed, Sarah remained by the memorial stone. She needed these few moments alone with her fallen friends. She traced each name with her finger, committing them to memory as if she could ever forget. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and gray hair. The woman introduced herself as Margaret, the mother of Specialist Thomas Wright, one of the soldiers killed in action. Margaret didn't cry. Instead, she thanked Sarah for bringing her son's body home, for honoring him with this memorial, for caring enough to make sure he wasn't forgotten. She told Sarah that Thomas had written letters home about his captain, about how much he respected her leadership and dedication. He had been proud to serve under her command. Margaret wanted Sarah to know that she didn't blame her for Thomas's death. She understood that war was complicated, that leaders made hard choices, and that sometimes brave people didn't come home. Before leaving, Margaret hugged Sarah tightly and whispered that her son would want Sarah to forgive herself and find peace. That moment broke something loose inside Sarah. Standing there under the oak tree, hugging a grieving mother who offered forgiveness she didn't deserve, Sarah began to cry. All the pain and guilt she had been holding came pouring out. And in that powerful silence that still lingered around the memorial, she began the long, difficult journey toward healing.